I thought letting my son and his wife move into my home would be the kindest thing I'd ever done. After my husband Gerald passed away 14 months ago, the house felt too big, too quiet, too full of everything I couldn't bring myself to touch. Our bedroom still had his reading glasses on the nightstand. His coffee mug, the chipped blue one from Gatlinburg, still sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it the morning he went to the hospital and never came home. So, when my son called me from Phoenix in late February and said he and Rebecca had lost their rental and needed somewhere to stay while they got back on their feet, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. Of course I did. What mother wouldn't? Tyler is my youngest. 34 years old, Gerald's eyes. My stubbornness. He'd always been the one I worried about more than his sister. Not because he was a bad person, but because he had a way of making things harder for himself than they needed to be. He and Rebecca had been married 6 years. She was pleasant enough, polished in a way that always made me feel slightly underdressed in my own kitchen. She sold real estate, or she had been selling real estate. The market had gotten rough, she said. Things had gotten tight. They arrived on a Thursday evening with 2 cars packed to the roof and a golden retriever named Winston, who immediately claimed Gerald's armchair. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was good to have noise in the house again. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center before I retired. I know how bodies work. I know how bodies work. I know how medications work. I know what it looks like when something is wrong, and I know how to stay calm when everything in me wants to panic. Those instincts saved me. The first 3 weeks were fine. Better than fine, actually. Tyler fixed the gutter that had been sagging since October. Rebecca reorganized the pantry and made a Thai soup that Gerald would have loved. We ate dinner together most nights. Winston learned not to jump on me. I thought maybe this was what I needed: purpose, company, a reason to cook real food instead of cereal at 7 in the evening. The thing that started the unraveling was small. Most things are. It was a Wednesday night just after 11. I'd gone to bed early with a headache and had woken up thirsty around 11:15. I came downstairs in the dark, padding toward the kitchen in my socks, and I noticed the light under the door to Gerald's study. The room I kept closed since he died. The room where he'd kept our financial records, our insurance documents, the deed to the house, and his roll-top desk that I still couldn't stand to look at for too long. The door was cracked open. I could hear voices. I stopped in the hallway and stood very still. The notary stamp is the hard part. That was Rebecca. Her voice was low, but I could hear the focus in it, the precision. She sounded like she was working, not whispering. Can you make it look real enough? Tyler, I've already done 3 of them. Look at this one. You can't even tell. I stood in the hallway with my hand pressed flat against the wall and felt something cold move through me. Not fear. Not yet. Something earlier than fear. The moment just before you understand what you're looking at. I went back upstairs. I did not get my water. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and replayed what I had heard, and I thought about Gerald, who had always said I had the sharpest instincts of anyone he knew. Trust what you notice, Dot. He used to tell me. Nurses don't survive 30 years in the ICU by ignoring things. The next morning, I watched them carefully over coffee. Tyler seemed relaxed, cheerful even, talking about a job lead he'd gotten in Nashville. Rebecca mentioned she had a showing that afternoon. Nothing looked wrong. That was somehow worse than if something had. Over the next several days, I started paying attention to things I'd been too grief-softened to notice before. On Friday, I tried to open Gerald's study and found the door locked. It hadn't been locked when they arrived. On Saturday morning, I noticed that a manila folder from the filing cabinet was sitting on the kitchen table, and when I went to look at it while Rebecca was in the shower, I found that it contained copies of Gerald's estate documents and, underneath them, what appeared to be a draft of a durable power of attorney form, with my name on it. My hands were steady when I put the folder back exactly where I found it. 31 years in emergency medicine will do that for you. On Sunday, I made an excuse about a migraine and spent 2 hours on my laptop while they took Winston for a walk. I pulled up my retirement accounts. Gerald and I had both worked for decades. We'd been careful. We had a joint account I hadn't checked in several weeks because the grief had made even small tasks feel enormous. What I found in that account made me set the laptop down on the bedspread and stare at the ceiling for a full minute before I could look again. $41,000. Gone in 3 separate wire transfers over the past 22 days, all bearing my electronic signature. Transfers to an account I did not recognize. I closed the laptop and thought about what to do next. I thought about Gerald, about the last week of his life when he was still lucid, when he held my hand and made me promise to look after myself. Not in the sentimental way people mean it, but practically. He'd been an accountant for 40 years. He meant it practically. Don't let people take advantage of you because you're tired and sad and lonely, Dot. You're stronger than that. Promise me. I promised him. What I did not do was confront Tyler and Rebecca that evening. I understand why people in these situations want to. The betrayal is so enormous, so personal, that every instinct screams to throw open the door and demand answers. But I had spent 3 decades in a hospital where reacting before you had the full picture got people killed. I was not going to make that mistake. I needed evidence. Undeniable, airtight, courtroom-quality evidence. On Monday, while they were both out, I drove to a Best Buy 30 minutes away and paid cash for 2 small wireless cameras, the kind disguised as USB wall adapters. I bought them myself, in person, because I didn't want the purchase showing up anywhere they might see. I also stopped at my attorney's office. Carol Briggs had handled Gerald's estate. She'd known us since we were in our 40s. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I told her enough. I think someone may be attempting to file fraudulent documents using my identity, I said. She looked at me over her reading glasses for a long moment. How recent? I believe it's ongoing. Dot. She leaned forward. Do you need me to freeze your assets pending an investigation? Not yet, I said. Give me a week. She gave me her direct cell number and told me to call at any hour. When I got home, Tyler and Rebecca were still out. I set up the cameras, one in the study, positioned inside the bookshelf behind a row of Gerald's old tax manuals, angled toward the desk, one in the kitchen, plugged in above the counter near the coffee maker, where I'd seen Rebecca laying out documents on 2 separate mornings. I linked both to an app on my phone and tested the feeds from my bedroom. The picture was clear. I could read the spines of the books in the study from 30 feet away. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. On Tuesday night, they must have assumed I was asleep. I was in bed with the lights out at 9:30, the way I'd been doing for weeks. The way grief had rearranged my entire relationship with time. What they didn't know was that I had my phone in my hand and both camera feeds open on the screen. At 11:42, the study light came on. I watched them on my phone in the dark. Rebecca sat down at Gerald's desk with a folder and what appeared to be a notary seal, a physical embosser, the kind you can buy online or, I later learned, steal from a real estate office. Tyler stood behind her, watching the door. She worked for nearly 20 minutes, moving deliberately, stamping pages, signing in 2 different places with what I recognized, even on the small screen, as a practiced imitation of my signature. The bank transfer request goes out Thursday, Rebecca said quietly. How much this time? 58. That brings us to just under 100. After the next one, we can start the guardianship filing. Tyler said nothing for a moment. Then, and she won't fight it. How is she going to fight it? How is she going to fight it? We have power of attorney, we have the medical evaluation doctor. Ferris agreed to write up, and we have the deed transfer she signed last week. She thinks she's still fully in charge of everything. A pause. She's sad, and she's old, and she trusts you. This was always going to be easy. I lay in my bed listening to my son say nothing in response to that. And I felt something I hadn't felt since Gerald's funeral. Absolute clarity. The next morning I called Carol. She came to the house at 10, while Tyler and Rebecca were at a coffee shop they went to every Wednesday morning, a habit I'd cataloged carefully over the preceding 10 days. I showed her the camera footage on my phone. I showed her the bank records. I showed her what I'd found in the filing cabinet when I finally used Gerald's spare key to open it. The completed power of attorney form with my forged signature, a draft deed transfer for the house, and a printout from a website about adult guardianship proceedings in Tennessee, with certain paragraphs highlighted in yellow. Carol sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "This is elder financial abuse, forgery, fraud. We need to involve law enforcement today." "I know," I said, "but I want to do this correctly. I don't want any part of this dismissed on a technicality." She nodded. She called her contact at the district attorney's office while I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and watched Winston sleep on Gerald's armchair. 2 detectives came that afternoon, a woman named Detective Hartley and her partner, a quiet man named Torres. I walked them through everything: the camera footage, the bank records, the forged documents, the notary seal Rebecca had hidden in her cosmetics bag in the guest bathroom, which I'd found and photographed without disturbing. They were thorough and methodical, and Detective Hartley had the kind of calm I recognized from my years in the ICU, the calm of someone who had seen enough to not be shocked, but had not become indifferent. "We'll need your authorization to obtain the bank records on the receiving account," she said. "You have it." "And we'll need you to do something difficult," Torres said. "We need you to act normal for 2 more days. Don't let them know. We want to catch the next transfer in real time." "I spent 31 years in trauma nursing," I told him. "I can act normal." That Thursday was the hardest 2 days of my life, compressed into 48 hours. I made dinner. I watched television with Tyler in the living room. I let Rebecca show me photos from a property listing she was supposedly working on. I asked Tyler about his job lead and listened to him talk about it and thought about Gerald's coffee mug sitting on the counter and how much I wanted this to be over. Thursday evening, Rebecca offered to make chamomile tea. I accepted. And when she set it in front of me and went upstairs to change out of her work clothes, I sniffed it carefully. 31 years of medical training. I knew the faint, bitter edge of Benadryl dissolved in liquid. I know what 50 milligrams of diphenhydramine smells like when it's been added to hot tea. I poured the tea into the kitchen sink, rinsed the mug, and put it in the dish rack. When she came back downstairs, I told her the tea had been lovely and that I was heading to bed early. I watched her glance toward the mug in the rack and something moved across her face. Satisfaction? Maybe. And I climbed the stairs and closed my bedroom door and sat in the dark and stared at my phone until 11:28 p.m. when the study camera showed Rebecca entering the room alone. I watched her pull up a laptop I hadn't known they had, a different one from the MacBook Rebecca used daily, a cheap Windows machine that she'd apparently been keeping out of sight. She opened a browser window. I couldn't read the screen clearly enough to make out the details, but I recognized the interface of an online banking portal. My online banking portal. At 11:46 p.m., my phone buzzed with an alert from my bank's fraud detection system. A transfer request for $58,000 had been initiated. I'd set up the alert 2 days earlier on Detective Hartley's instruction. I texted her immediately. She texted back 2 words, "We're here." I learned later that they had been parked down the street since 9 o'clock. I was in the hallway at the top of the stairs when the front door opened. Tyler came up from the basement where he'd been watching television. He stopped when he saw me standing there in my bathrobe in the dark. "Mom, what are you doing up?" I was about to ask Rebecca the same thing, I said. And then Detective Hartley came through the front door with her badge out. What happened next is something I replay differently depending on the day. Sometimes I remember it as very fast. Sometimes it seems to have taken hours. Tyler went pale and started talking immediately, too quickly, stumbling over himself, saying that it wasn't what it looked like, that Rebecca had made him, that he hadn't wanted any of this. I noticed that he didn't look at me when he said it. He couldn't. Rebecca came out of the study when she heard the voices and stood in the hallway, holding the laptop with her face completely still. The way a person looks when they've already run every calculation and know none of them come out in their favor. "Mom," Tyler said finally, "I'm so sorry." I looked at my youngest child, the one with Gerald's eyes and my stubbornness, and I felt the grief and the fury and the love all tangled together in a way I couldn't have described then and still can't entirely describe now. "I know you are," I said. "That doesn't help me much right now." They were both arrested that night. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, elder financial abuse, forgery of legal documents, fraudulent notarization, and criminal conspiracy. The receiving account, when the detectives traced it, turned out to be registered to a shell LLC Rebecca had set up in Nevada 8 months earlier. 8 months. 2 months. 2 months before they'd called me with their story about losing the rental. They had been planning this before Gerald was even in the ground. At trial, Rebecca's attorney tried to minimize her role, arguing that Tyler had been the instigator, that she'd been following his lead out of financial desperation and fear. The prosecution had 46 days of camera footage, 3 banks' worth of financial records, and the testimony of the notary whose seal Rebecca had stolen from a former colleague. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Tyler received 9 years. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Givens, was direct in her sentencing remarks. She said that Tyler had exploited a mother's grief in the most calculated and prolonged manner she had seen in 22 years on the bench, and that the presence of a co-conspirator did not diminish his culpability. It compounded it. Rebecca received 9 years. Judge Givens was equally direct with her. "The financial sophistication of this scheme," she said, "the shell corporation, the fraudulent notarization, the targeted timing, this was not desperation. This was predation." Equal sentences. Equal sentences. Equal guilt. I had asked Carol to communicate that to the prosecution, that I believed they were equally responsible, and the evidence bore it out. I recovered all but $11,000 of the stolen money. The civil judgment covered the rest. The house is still mine. That last part matters to me more than I expected it to. Not because of the money. Those 64 years of working and saving makes you protective of what you've built. It matters because Gerald and I bought this house when Tyler was 6 years old. We painted every room ourselves over 2 weekends in October. We planted the dogwood in the front yard for our 20th anniversary. This was not just an asset on a balance sheet. It was the place where I cooked Christmas dinner for 30 years and where Gerald's coffee mug still sits on the counter, because I decided to leave it there, and that decision is mine to make. I changed the locks the week after the arrests. I had Gerald's study repainted, the same warm cream color it had always been, but fresh. I went through his desk myself, slowly, on a Sunday afternoon with Winston at my feet and a cup of tea I had made myself. I found his old reading glasses in the top drawer, the ones I thought he'd lost. I held them for a long time. People have asked me how I stayed calm through all of it, how I sat across the dinner table from my son knowing what I knew, how I watched Rebecca hand me a cup of drugged tea and thanked her for it, how I waited and gathered and planned instead of breaking down. I tell them the honest answer. I wasn't calm. I was heartbroken every single day. I grieved Tyler before any sentence was ever handed down, in the same way you grieve someone who is still standing in front of you. The son I raised, who I drove to soccer practice and stayed up late helping with his college applications and danced with at his wedding, was not fully present in the man who stood in my hallway and said, "I'm so sorry," while looking at the floor. But grief is not the same as helplessness. That's the thing I want people to understand. You can be devastated and still be dangerous to the people who underestimate you. You can miss your husband so much it feels like a physical injury and still be competent enough to buy a camera at Best Buy and set up a banking alert and have your attorney on speed dial. I am 64 years old. I live alone in a house in Nashville with a golden retriever named Winston and the ghost of a man I loved for 38 years. My knees hurt when rain is coming. I read the newspaper in the actual paper form because I like the sound of it. I am not young. I am not fast. But I am not confused. And I am not easy. And I am not available to be managed. Tyler writes from prison. I haven't responded yet. I'm not certain what I want to say, or whether what I want to say is something I'm actually capable of meaning. Forgiveness is complicated when someone has made you a target. It's not impossible. I was a nurse for 31 years, and I believe in the possibility of people getting better. But I also spent 31 years learning that healing is not a thing you can rush by pretending it's already happened. Maybe someday. Right now, on a Wednesday evening in October, I am sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I made myself from a bag I opened myself and a mug that was on sale at the Kroger last week, and has a small painting of a lighthouse on it that Gerald would have found aggressively cheerful. The dogwood in the front yard is at its best right now, just starting to turn. The light in the study is on because I've been going through Gerald's old tax files, and it turns out 30 years of meticulous record-keeping is both a blessing and an organizational nightmare. Carol called this afternoon to say the civil judgment had been finalized and the last funds would be returned to my account by the end of the month. I thanked her and meant it. Detective Hartley stopped by last week just to check in. She said she thought I'd like to know that Rebecca's attorney had filed an appeal and the court had declined to hear it. I made her coffee, and she sat at this table and told me about a case she was working, and asked my opinion on it, because she knew I'd spent decades reading people's bodies and faces under pressure. We talked for an hour. She is 37 years old and very good at her job, and it occurs to me that the world is full of competent, serious women who are just getting on with things, and that is quietly one of the best realizations I've ever had. People sometimes say I'm brave. I know they mean it kindly. I don't think what I did was bravery. Bravery is when you don't have the tools and you act anyway. I had 31 years of experience reading dangerous situations. I had Gerald's voice in my head telling me to trust what I notice. I had Carol Briggs's direct cell number and two $50 cameras and enough presence of mind to pour a cup of drugged tea down the drain. What I had was more than enough. That's what I want other women my age to understand, women who are grieving and tired and being told in 100 quiet ways that they're past the point of being formidable. You are not past the point of being formidable. You are just past the point of being impressed by people who underestimate you. The night it all ended, after the detectives had gone and the cars had pulled away and the house was quiet again, I stood in the front yard in the dark for a long time. The neighborhood was still. Winston was inside pressing his nose against the window screen, watching me the way dogs watch you when they know something has shifted. I looked at the dogwood. I looked at the house with its lit windows and its new locks. Gerald would be proud. Not of what Tyler did. Nothing could make that anything other than what it was. But of what I did, of the fact that I paid attention, that I didn't dismiss what I noticed because I was afraid of what it meant, that I gathered my evidence quietly and completely and brought it to the right people and let the process work. That's what he always said. Trust what you notice. Do the work. Let the process work. I went back inside. I locked the door behind me. I sat down at the kitchen table and made a grocery list for the week. Chicken, more tea, batteries for the smoke detector in the hallway, a new book, something I haven't read, something with enough story to carry me through the nights that are still hard. And flowers, I thought. Something bright for the kitchen table. Gerald always kept flowers on the kitchen table. I'm going to keep doing that.